Daniela a été la présidente de Nucléaire Electrica en Roumanie. Elle est maintenant, je l'ai dit, chef de la politique, de l'office politique de l'AEN à l'OCDE. Et nous sommes maintenant devenus amis depuis quelques années. Et elle va animer cette première séance et je la laisse avec ses invités. C'est elle la chef.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you so much. It was very good to hear Mr. Grossi's speech. I think it's okay. Okay, I'll try to do that. So I start by saying good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. And of course, special thanks to Claude for bringing us together and for giving us the chance to tackle and to discuss, to present the different positions regarding this interesting and of high importance topic. So, as mentioned before, we are here today to talk about the nuclear investments. And why to talk about nuclear investments? Because I think it is already common knowledge that almost all governments, but at least governments all over the world, as well as experts, have identified the climate crisis as the one defining the challenges for this generation. So, although the scientific community was initially hopeful for the reductions of global emissions, currently we are in fact expecting to see a rise of 16% by 2030. No problem. So, even though the emissions were to remain constant, the entire carbon budget would have been consumed within 8 years. Now, in fact, we are looking at a rise. We have to find solutions, and probably it's impossible not to make the rest of the world listen at least to the nuclear solution. Because I like to believe that not just for us being here today in this room and being involved and engaged in this industry, but finally for the rest of the world, the nuclear solution will be seen as being part of the challenge and part of the solution with an important role to play. Because despite the comprehensive analysis from a lot of credible sources, including the NEA I'm working for, which is, and we are trying to urge the community for an all-of-the-above approach. So despite all those arguments, all those fact-based analyses, unfortunately, we are not there, at least not for the time being. However, one thing is certain, and that is that if countries do not invest in nuclear energy, they will be faced with the greater risk of not meeting the Paris targets. The IEA, the International Energy Agency, estimates that it would cost the world around $1.6 trillion more to meet the Paris targets without the nuclear energy. Around 10% of the world's electricity is supplied by nuclear energy, which means you all know 444 nuclear power reactors worldwide which are in operation today. Nuclear, it is the largest source of non-emitting electricity generation in OECD countries, and the second largest after the hydropower. It is also important to note that existing nuclear capacity displaces 1.5 gigatons of carbon dioxide emissions annually, which means since 1971, because Mr. Grossi was talking about science-based and fact-based decisions. Sorry if if I do come with too many numbers, but at the NEA we are really trying to come with numbers and fact-based information, so we are not accused of being biased because we are called the Nuclear Energy Agency. So, if we take the 1.5 gigatons of carbon dioxide emissions annually, it means that since 1971, 66 gigatons of carbon dioxide emissions have been displaced, which is the equivalent of 2 years of global emissions. So there are certainly different pathways forward. However, coming with more data, the IPCC outlined important scenarios in their report from 2018. And for example, in order to limit the average global warming to less than 1.5 Celsius, they found that in average, it would require nuclear to reach around 1,160 gigawatts of electricity by 2050, which means several times more than what we have today, which is 394 gigawatts. So the question we may ask ourselves is the rapid build-out of nuclear power possible? From our point of view, yes. The answer is undoubtful yes. But the past experience have demonstrated that it requires a clear vision supported by the right policy frameworks and, of course, by programmatic approaches. And we do have examples in this regard. In less than 2 decades, France and Canada have both decarbonized their electricity mix with nuclear power and with hydropower. Coming to nowadays, the Baraka project in the United Arab Emirates has demonstrated clearly that a rapid and efficient deployment can indeed be achieved even nowadays with the Generation 3 reactors. New build and construction pace in countries such as Korea or China is more advanced and has reached an average of 5 to 6 years. And all this just to prove that, yes, it is possible. While technical challenges do exist and require sustained investment and international cooperation, the main challenges of the nuclear field, unfortunately, or hopefully, happily, they are non-technical. In fact, we are talking about costs, we are talking about timeliness, we are talking about public confidence, we are talking about financing. An important area of the nuclear investments and specificities is understanding and reducing costs, and we are here today and tomorrow to talk a lot about that. I must say that in this field, the NEA is working a lot, and we've produced a number of reports which are looking at ways to reduce the cost of nuclear, at ways to integrate nuclear in hybrid energy systems. In a lot of costs, one of them I'm pretty sure my colleague Michelle, who will speak tomorrow, will cover the system cost and reducing the cost of electricity. So it's really an area where we started to look more and more, and we came with outcomes which I think are of high interest for everyone. For example, the system cost findings have significant policy implications because, as I said, at the end of the day, we have to tackle policy. Because in this study, the NEA findings clearly indicate that options for backing up variable renewables become increasingly expensive. And therefore, as the ratio of variable resources are growing, in fact, the dispatchable hydro or nuclear power are the only economic options to really move on. While batteries remain an option, a lot of people discuss about that, but for the time being, they're there just for the short-term storage. More importantly, decarbonizing the electricity sector in a cost-effective manner requires structural market reforms to address the impact of such an integration of different resources, especially the ones with high shares of renewables. As we all know, the nuclear energy projects are capital intensive, and the cost of capital in many such projects represents up to 75% of the production cost. There is also the perception, at least among the financiers, and to some extent among the policymakers, or at least among some of the policymakers, that the nuclear energy projects are often delayed and cost significantly overrun, and due to that, maybe it's not the right option to invest. And for sure, the nuclear sector needs to demonstrate that it can meet the cost reduction objectives, that it can stay in time and in budget, and to address the nuclear construction risks. But again, I think it is clearly, there are some other examples to clearly show that we can do that. So the fact that we have to really pay attention to all these factors doesn't change the fact that all the capital infrastructure projects, including nuclear projects, in a way or another rely on the support from the government and on the risk sharing which needs to find a new structure and a new approach in order to really become reality. So the right policy frameworks can address the construction and the market risks. And governments can, depending of course on their national context and project characteristics, to consider different financing models for the nuclear new builds. So, and yeah, I'll try with that to introduce the first panel. I would just conclude my opening remarks by saying that the nuclear should be in the forefront of the discussions on taxonomies, on climate change, and in particular on the ESG criteria. And it is important from the governments to see policy frameworks which would support a technology-neutral approach. We are not necessarily asking for favors for nuclear, just a foreign neutral approach. And with that, I will transition to the very first panel, and we have the honor of having with us by Zoom, as far as I know, Mr. Louis Gallois, who is the former CEO of Airbus and Commissioner for Investments in France, and who will focus his speech on public investments, because yeah, nuclear, it is one of the categories of the public investments. And after that, immediately after, we'll have a video delivered by Mr. Helm, who will talk about the different financing structures, followed by a Q&A session where I hope that Mr. Gallois will make us the honor to stay.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Pour aborder la question du financement des projets nucléaires, il est nécessaire de s'interroger sur la nature même de ce qui doit produire, c'est-à-dire de l'électricité. Est-ce une marchandise, une commodité, comme vous anglais, comme les autres, ou est-ce un bien public, selon la terminologie européenne, un bien économique d'intérêt général? La distinction est fondamentale. L'Union européenne a assez nettement pu pencher la balance du côté de la commodité comme les autres. Nous avons créé un marché unique, la règle de la concurrence s'applique, c'est la séparation, le producteur est séparé du distributeur, les producteurs historiques ont été obligés de mettre à niveau leurs concurrents en leur fournissant de l'électricité à prix fixe. Un marché de gros a été créé, fixant les prix sur la base de l'offre et de la demande, ou plus exactement, sur le coût de la source qui apporte les bienfaits électrons pour assurer l'équilibre de l'offre et de la demande. Le plus souvent d'ailleurs, parce que la demande est forte et l'offre a des difficultés à suivre, c'est l'augmentation du prix du gaz qui se traduit sur le marché électrique. En tout état de cause, s'y ajoute l'intermittence des énergies renouvelables, qui ajoute à l'imprévisibilité et à la volatilité du marché. Marché imprévisible, volatile, sujet éventuellement à des manipulations, mais qui en tout cas génère une industrie financière puissante autour de cette imprévisibilité, de cette volatilité. Donc je reviendrai sur ce point, parce qu'il est essentiel. Tout cela se fait, il faut bien dire, au bénéfice des énergies renouvelables, intermittentes, qui ne payent pas le prix de leur intermittence, le coût de leur intermittence, et au détriment de l'énergie nucléaire, pilotable, disponible en Europe, compétitive en termes de coût et non émettrice de CO2, et qui est soumise à contribution pour permettre à la concurrence de fonctionner. Je crois que l'actualité nous conduit à réexaminer les choses du marché tel qu'il a été construit et de revenir à une conception et de considérer au niveau européen la production d'électricité comme un service d'intérêt général tel que cette notion a été définie à la suite du rapport d'Atrop de 2004. C'est dans ce cadre, et pas dans celui d'un marché dit plus parfait, où on voit les inconvénients et les aberrations, nous devons aborder la question du financement des projets nucléaires en Europe. Du fait même de la lutte contre le réchauffement climatique, ou des dérèglements climatiques, pour reprendre l'expression de l'autrichien Herzog, et même si on encourage à juste titre les économies de consommation, il est clair que le besoin d'électricité va croître du fait du basculement sur les usages électriques de pratiquement tous les domaines de l'activité, que ça concerne l'industrie, l'agriculture, la mobilité, le logement, le chauffage des logements, le numérique, etc. On voit bien que dans tous ces domaines, c'est l'électricité qui va se substituer à notre source d'énergie. Je prends le seul cas de la France pour voir quelles sont les conséquences. La consommation actuelle est de l'ordre de 480 TWh, dont 70%, cela veut dire 350 TWh, en moyenne, d'énergie nucléaire sont sollicités. La prévision pour 2050 d'EDF, c'est le quasi-doublement de cette consommation annuelle. On va donc vers les 900 TWh. Même si on se limitait aux 50% que le gouvernement français souhaite donner au nucléaire, 50% est un chiffre d'ailleurs qui n'a pas de justification, qui me paraît très bas et probablement irréaliste, même si on se limitait à ces 50%, cela veut dire que la production d'énergie nucléaire devrait être de 450 TWh en 2050. Donc, nous devons trouver 100 TWh supplémentaires pour le nucléaire. 100 TWh, j'ai fait un calcul que peut-être d'autres démentiront, c'est de l'ordre de 15 tranches nucléaires. Cela veut dire que non seulement il va falloir investir pour maintenir les capacités actuelles, et peut-être remplacer, quand il y a le carénage, il peut y avoir le remplacement de certains des réacteurs en service dans les dizaines d'années qui vont suivre, mais en plus, il va falloir augmenter la capacité. Au niveau de l'Europe, l'Union européenne prévoit 400 milliards d'euros d'ici 2050 sur le seul maintien de la capacité actuelle. On vient de voir que la France devra aller bien au-delà du maintien de la capacité actuelle. Et on sait qu'un grand pays comme la Pologne, par exemple, va avoir à s'équiper pour échapper au gaz russe. Les besoins de financement colossaux qui vont être mobilisés, qui vont émerger, ne pourront être satisfaits que si toutes les sources possibles d'épargne sont mobilisées. Ce n'est clairement pas à la hauteur des capacités des entreprises productrices actuelles. Cela dépasse largement les obligations vertes, auxquelles d'ailleurs, pour le moment, le nucléaire n'a pas accès. Cela dépasse probablement la capacité de financement des États. Donc il va falloir mobiliser toutes les sources de financement et les associer, financement public et financement privé. Je crois que vous avez évoqué les montages possibles. Je voudrais faire seulement une remarque. Si nous faisons appel à des financements privés, il faudra des prix de l'électricité. Ce sont évidemment des financements de très long terme, de long terme. Il faudra des prix de l'électricité suffisamment stables, prévisibles, pour gérer le risque, pour permettre aux investisseurs de gérer le risque et d'assurer leur rémunération. On n'attirera pas pour des financements à long terme des investisseurs sur une commodité, pour reprendre le terme, dont la volatilité est telle que nous la connaissons sur le marché actuel de l'électricité. Je crois que seul le nucléaire est capable d'assurer la stabilité de recherche, des recherches et des investisseurs, mais en même temps, pour que les investisseurs viennent, il va falloir que nous ayons des mécanismes de fixation des prix d'électricité qui leur permettent de faire les calculs de risque qu'ils souhaitent. Un dernier point, si vous voulez bien. Ce qui me conduit d'ailleurs à ajouter une chose, je trouve assez extraordinaire que seules les énergies intermittentes aient étonnant la Attendez, pardon, je crois qu'il y a une voix qui est en même temps que la mienne. Je vous fais une remarque qui est quand même une aberration. C'est qu'actuellement, les énergies intermittentes ont accès à des contrats à long terme de fourniture et que le nucléaire n'a pas accès. C'est une des demandes d'EDF en France de pouvoir négocier des accords de long terme avec ses clients sur l'énergie nucléaire. Un dernier point. Tous les pays européens ont pas fait le choix du nucléaire. C'est bien sûr leur droit. Il ne faut pas que cela entraîne une impossibilité des prix de l'électricité, je veux dire. Mais aussi, il ne faut pas que le nucléaire soit l'objet d'une prise d'otage dans le cadre de la taxonomie. Parce qu'on voudrait faire passer le gaz, on tient en otage le nucléaire. Or, je rappelle que le gaz émet 70 fois plus de CO2 que le nucléaire. Ça, c'est le premier élément. Deuxièmement, le fait qu'il y ait des avis divergents en Europe et dans le monde fait que les institutions qui fonctionnent sur le nucléaire, je pense à l'Euratom en particulier, sont probablement dans une très grande difficulté de définir leur politique, puisque au sein de l'Euratom se trouvent des pays qui ont fait le choix du nucléaire et des pays qui ont fait le choix de le quitter. Je pense donc qu'il faut essayer de trouver la même chose dans les organismes de l'OCDE. Je pense donc qu'il faut permettre aux États qui font le choix du nucléaire de négocier ce qu'on appelle au sein de l'Europe une coopération renforcée entre pays qui donc ont des projets de développement nucléaire et que cette coopération renforcée peut notamment porter sur la question du financement des infrastructures. Je crois que si nous nous regroupons entre pays nucléaires pour créer des conditions de financement des infrastructures, nous aurons une capacité, une force de frappe supérieure qui devrait faciliter les choses. Voilà ce que je voulais dire à ce stade et je vous remercie de m'avoir écouté.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gallois. Claude, I suggest we have the video from Sir Helm, and then have the questions from the audience.
The decision to build new nuclear power stations or not is ultimately a political one. And the reason for that is that the issues at stake and the time scales and the waste and the risks associated with everything that is nuclear, the military dimensions, all of these are matters that the private sector can't handle on its own. And indeed, we wouldn't want private firms with limited liabilities deciding whether and to what extent to have nuclear power stations on the energy systems. So that's a big political, social, as well as economic issue, and that's for governments to decide about. What I'm interested in is how you would fund and finance a new nuclear power station if that's what you decided to do. So I make no judgment about whether we should or should not do more nuclear power. And when I say we, any individual country, the EU, and more generally globally, but merely focus on how you would do it if that's what you wanted to do. So when it comes to thinking about the funding and financial structure of a new nuclear project, the starting point is to look at the things which are the economic characteristics of the projects. So what are these? Well, the projects are obviously long-lived. These power stations may generate for 40, even 50, 60 years. And clearly how we treat costs over time and discounting is crucial. So that's one thing. The second thing is that they are lumpy, fixed, sunk cost capital projects, making the cost of capital absolutely crucial, in fact the dominant variable. And for investors, it is a matter of putting the money up and waiting quite a long time before revenues start to flow from the sales of electricity. Maybe a decade for a new project, sometimes longer. Then there's the zero marginal cost issue, which is that once the fixed capital costs are sunk, once they become sunk costs, the costs of operation, the marginal costs, are much, much lower than the average costs, and therefore there's always the vulnerability that regulators and governments ex post, once the project is up and running, might screw prices back to those very low marginal costs. It's a problem that's shared with wind farms and solar panels and so on, all these new zero or near zero marginal cost projects coming onto electricity systems. And that creates, given the capital costs involved, the time inconsistency problem. Any investor wants a contract, and in this case, ultimately with government and regulators, that if they sink their capital ex ante, they won't be screwed ex post. A long-term contract of some form is of the essence of any framework which enables nuclear power stations to be funded and financed. So we have to look to the project characteristics in order to work out how you would fund and finance a project if that's what you wanted to do. So what are the options? Well, the option that most countries have chosen for the over 400 nuclear power stations which have in the past been built globally has been for the state to do the job. That's the overridingly most popular route, notably in France, but also in the UK. Great state-owned nationalised industries like EDF and the CEGB in the UK channeled state funds through into the construction of these projects and absorbed the risk within the state. That is undoubtedly the way to get the lowest cost of capital, but it's also one which comes with all the baggage of being in the hands of the state for projects of these sorts of complexities and costs. And a number of countries, of course, experimented very early on with ways to get the private sector to carry nuclear projects forward, albeit in a protected public sector framework. Rate of return regulation in the United States is the most obvious example. There are similar examples in Japan as well of using that mixed approach. It looks unlikely in Europe, certainly outside France, and even EDF is partly privately owned, that the state is going to build nuclear power stations going forward as wholly owned state entities. So then we turn to ways in which the state can help to guarantee those sunken fixed costs, solve the time inconsistency problems, and also, by the way, solve the problems of carbon pricing, so that the private sector can go forward knowing that their investment has a reasonable chance of washing its face financially. In the UK, two particular mechanisms have been discussed, and indeed one of them has been already implemented for the Hinkley twin nuclear reactor currently under construction. And that is the idea of a contract for difference, of picking a price, a wholesale price of electricity from now and into the future for quite a long time, indexed to inflation, and then effectively saying, if you build the power station and it generates electricity, you can have this price for that electricity for what, 30, 35 years or whatever it is, and that's your guaranteed revenue flow. So you put up the capital, you do the investing, and you take the risk of the construction of the project, but when it comes on stream, we guarantee, provided you generate the units, this is how much you're going to get paid. And that can work, but it relies upon companies taking on the risks in advance of the project and waiting maybe a decade or more before the pound or the euro starts to be paid to them. And it's no accident the Hinkley project involves two essentially state-owned entities. CGN, which is essentially a Chinese state nuclear company, and EDF, which, as I mentioned, is 85% state-controlled. So what's really happening here is companies whose balance sheets are effectively guaranteed by their states are bearing the costs before the revenue flows. If we move on to alternatives, the model which the UK is now seriously considering, and it's one that I proposed in some detail in a paper back in 2018, is to treat the investment in a nuclear power station as essentially the creation and sustaining of a regulatory asset base, a RAB. And the RAB model is pretty straightforward, very familiar for other infrastructure, which again has near zero marginal costs and sunken fixed costs and exposed to all the problems of time inconsistency. So it's a well-known model, and the idea is essentially the following, that as investment funds are deployed, the project allows, through the regulatory medium, that the capital costs, the agreed capital costs, go into the RAB, and that the costs that are agreed and in the RAB are recovered from the customers of the electricity system through some sort of user system charge, and therefore those who are funding the project can rely upon a return on those regulatory assets. So it's pretty straightforward. It's like a long-term contract. You sink the following amount of money, we'll put it in the RAB, and you'll get an agreed rate of return upon that. and off you go. The simple notion of the RAB is, however, deceptive. There are a number of complexities behind it, and these complexities affect the way in which it works in practice, and therefore helps to determine the risk between the parties in the project and ultimately the cost of capital. So the most fundamental issue is whether the assets are on a pay-as-you-go basis. As you spend them, they go in. As you spend the money, it goes into the RAB, and you get your revenue as you go along, or pay when delivered, which is we'll put the money in the RAB when you finish the project, when you've delivered, and once you've delivered, we'll guarantee that return, but you have to get there first. The second route is very like the CFD. The first route is much more like traditional old-fashioned US rate of return regulation. And there are enormous number of options between those two extremes. So we could say, look, you start spending every 5 years, what we call in the UK the periodic review point. We'll have a look at how much you've spent, work out what's efficiently been spent, and we'll put it into the regulatory asset base. We might review whether it's efficient, whether you did what you said you were going to do, whether you're on time, and so on. But there will be a regular series of milestones or checkpoints when the RAB is updated, and so you get a pay-as-you-go with a slight lag. Could go all the way and say, well, you know, every 10 years we'll have a look at how you're doing, and at that point we'll upgrade. And how close you get to real-time updating and how far you get towards only with discrete intervals is really a distinction which feeds through into whether you're getting assets in the course of construction paid for as you construct them, or whether you're getting a ex-post return for your investment once you deliver. The model that we've used in the UK for big projects is actually the Thames Tideway very large-scale sewer, the tunnel going under the Thames to take sewage from upstream from London to downstream, where a regulatory asset base is used. It's assets in the course of construction. It's fed through Thames Water, the local utility, and on to customers. That's a crucial choice. And the more it's genuinely assets in the course of construction, obviously the lower the risk to the funders, and the lower the risk, therefore, to financing the project, and therefore the lower cost of capital. And the economics of nuclear power are determined by how low that cost of capital is, as to whether it's cost competitive or not with other forms of low carbon generation. So that's the issue of the timing as you go along. The next issue is the guarantee. So who's responsible ultimately for making sure you actually get paid the return on the RAB? And within the UK system, and it basically mirrors the rules of the internal energy market, that's almost certainly going to be the energy regulator. So there would be a license for the power station, probably negotiated in the UK case by the Secretary of State, but the regulator would regulate that license, and in particular the regulatory asset base, and have a duty in law to ensure that the entity can finance its functions, and in particular that it's properly rewarded for the regulatory asset base. And that's utterly crucial, because otherwise what happens when somebody comes along later, say a regulator, and says, you know what, the world's changed quite a lot, there are some new technologies that come along, we're not clear you've really efficiently spent this money, so we're going to question whether or not you should get a reward. For an investor, that's the critical point. Can you go to the courts? Can you enforce that contract? The RAB is essentially a long-term contract, or not? And how difficult will it be to carry that through? Will it take years of legal wrangling, or will it be pretty much instantaneous? So those are core issues which the UK is dealing with in thinking about the regulatory asset models for future nuclear power stations like at Sizewell, and also, by the way, for CCS projects offshore for carbon capture and storage. and even possibly for hydrogen projects. There's one final issue in this framework, in the neat way it's been set up, which of course matters. All of this assumes that when the costs are passed on to consumers, they can actually pay. They will pay, they'll effectively vote to pay, and they're able to do so because they can afford it. Well, the stark reality across Europe is that almost all the infrastructure utility costs are on a sharp rise. The capex required across the board is very large, and if you look at the state of many average and below average income households emerging from the COVID experience and the lockdowns, it's not at all clear that they can pay their water bills, their energy bills, their transport bills, their communication bills, and also their bills from rising food, housing and related costs too, that they can pay them all. And what tends to happen is people say, well, nuclear is only going to cost this extra much the bill, and everyone can afford, €1 a week or whatever it is. But that's not how consumers think about these things, and it's not how they vote. They vote for the totality of the bill. And so what the RAB model genuinely has to do is force the regulator to make sure that the entity can finance its functions, it gets its money. And if the customers can't or won't pay, implicitly the state has to pay. And what that really means is the difference between the regulatory model with a guarantee to finance functions and the state direct funding and financing of a nuclear problem is a matter of degree and not kind. Because the RAB model ultimately puts taxpayers on the hook if the customers can't or won't pay the required sums. So all of these mechanisms are just different ways of getting at a long-term contract. They're different ways of making commitment, and they're different ways of allowing investors to discount the risk that they're confronted with. Of course, there's some other financing issues too. What about the decommissioning costs? What about the waste? How's that going to be handled? It may be a long time in the future, and the discount rate will be crucial to the valuation of that, but what kind of pension fund is going to be set up to enable that to happen? And what happens if the company that builds the nuclear power station now isn't around in 60 years' time to take care of the costs? Well, limited liability is not really compatible with nuclear power, and what that means is that the end liabilities ultimately have a state component. And then there's nuclear safety and nuclear regulations. I mean, one of the reasons why the cost of nuclear keeps going up is every time there is an accident anywhere in the world, regulators are asked to take a good look, and almost any regulator will come back with another couple of safety measures that they think might be appropriate. Not many regulators will come along and say, you know what, this is really safe, and in fact the regulation is too tight and we ought to make it a little easier going forward. They're always going to turn up the ratchet. And for an investor, this is a nightmare, because you don't know what regulators are going to come along and do to your project, which may change the whole configuration of the project and may well raise the costs. It's why when the French built their 50+ nuclear reactors, despite the serial production, despite all the supply chain advantages of building one after the other, costs kept going up. And it's because the regulation kept changing. And Fukushima was the latest example of raising the costs of virtually all nuclear power stations by virtue of ratcheting up the safety requirements. Now, I make no judgment at all on whether these extra safety precautions are wise or not, and whether they're worth the costs. But that's an extra insulation that any investor and funder will need to have in order to keep to a low cost of capital, which, as I keep stressing, is the essence of any nuclear power station. So, looking forward, the problem of financing and funding a nuclear power station is all about the particular economic characteristics of the project, There are straightforward ways of doing this, and the RAB model, in my mind, is the best one of these. What is important in this frame is that there's some kind of coherence across the pitch between the member states, so that we have a common framework for doing this within the internal energy market. Inside the UK, post-Brexit, of course, we can choose our own path, but energy is not an island activity. We're all part of the European system, and hopefully this is one example post-Brexit where the EU can still borrow experience and examples from the UK. Whether any or all countries choose to build new nuclear as part of their drives towards decarbonisation, well, that's an open question, and that's not one that I choose to answer in this short video. I hope that's helpful. Thank you for listening, and hope it puts in the frame some of the options ahead.
Thank you very much. A very interesting video. What I would like to do until the first panel members are ready to join me here, I'll take the advantage of having Mr. Gallois together with us, because there are some similarities in the presentations of the two gentlemen. And I would ask Mr. Gallois, from his point of view, which are the most important changes of the electricity market he considers necessary, even if we speak about France or about the European space, or even a larger one.
Je voudrais faire un commentaire sur les propos de notre collègue britannique qui montre bien une chose, c'est que mobiliser des financements privés sur 40 ans, 50 ans, peut-être 60 ans, est une extrême difficulté. Parce qu'aucun investisseur n'est prêt à supporter les aléas d'une aussi longue période. Il cherche donc à trouver quelqu'un qui garantisse le revenu qu'il escompte. Et celui qui est garanti le revenu qu'il escompte, ça peut être soit le client, à travers un prix d'électricité fixé à l'avance, soit les États. Je pense que les clients ont une capacité à supporter cette garantie qui est limitée, que donc on risque de se retourner vers les États. Et je pense que les États doivent se poser la question de savoir s'il est plus intéressant pour eux de faire appel à des investisseurs privés ou d'utiliser leur capacité d'endettement pour financer directement un coût qui peut être compétitif par rapport à celui qui permet d'attirer les investisseurs. Parce que dès lors que les aléas sont in fine supportés par les États, aléas de marché, aléas d'accident et autres, dès lors qu'ils sont supportés par les États, on se trouve dans une situation extrêmement délicate où les investisseurs ont un revenu quasiment garanti et où tous les aléas sont supportés par la puissance publique, c'est-à-dire par les contribuables. Je pense que là, nous avons un vrai sujet. Je n'exclus pas du tout que l'on fasse appel à des financements privés. Mais je pense qu'on ne peut pas faire appel à des financements privés s'il n'y a pas un certain partage de risque. Et évidemment, s'il y a un partage de risque, ça reste que tout est plus cher. Voilà une remarque que je voulais faire. Sur le fonctionnement du marché, je crois que, si je me permets d'aborder ce sujet, je ne suis pas un spécialiste, je le précise tout de suite. Mais une chose qui me paraît claire, c'est que les l'électricité doit être payée par le consommateur à hauteur de son coût de production, plus la marge nécessaire pour les opérateurs pour qu'ils puissent assurer le maintien de leur capacité de production. Et donc, ce n'est pas un véritable marché qui me paraît nécessaire, c'est une analyse des coûts qui permettent à chaque énergie, à chaque opérateur d'être rémunéré en fonction de ses investissements. Et que les énergies intermittentes soient mises à la même enseigne que le nucléaire. Que les énergies intermittentes soient mises en compétition avec le nucléaire sur ce sujet et qu'elles ne bénéficient pas d'une sorte de priorité qui n'a pas de justification dès lors qu'elles sont elles aussi très largement financées avec des aides publiques. Je rappelle qu'en France, les énergies renouvelables solaires et éoliennes, qui représentent maintenant près de 13 à 15% de la consommation d'électricité de la France, ont coûté 160 milliards sur les dernières années. Donc ce sont des montants considérables qui font qu'il n'y a pas de raison de leur donner une priorité, soit d'accès à des financements, soit d'accès au marché. Et je pense encore une fois qu'il faut aller vers des mécanismes de marché qui traduisent les coûts de production et la marge nécessaire des opérateurs et qui ne soient pas soumis à cette volatilité extraordinaire que nous connaissons actuellement, qui est complètement perturbatrice et qui fait que les énergies pilotables sont constamment mis en situation d'assurer la fourniture de l'électricité, même dans des conditions qui évidemment ne sont pas optimum pour voilà ce que je voulais dire sur le marché. En fait, moi, je ne suis pas un spécialiste. Ça veut dire des contrats à terme, ça veut dire, encore une fois, la fin des privilèges accordés aux énergies renouvelables, et qui sont à terme qui vont payer le coût de leur dépense, et ça veut dire une situation où le nucléaire peut développer sa compétitivité. Je crois que c'est l'intérêt des consommateurs, des clients, et de ce bien public qu'est l'électricité.
Yes, you are, and thank you very much. And everyone is listening to you with a lot of attention. Okay. So, if with your permission, I will ask the audience here in the room if we do have any questions for you. Or if on the Zoom we do have any questions from the audience. It seems we don't.
Yes.
Yep. Okay. Thank you very much. Very interesting